Hey, good afternoon to you. It's 4:06 now, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, Julie Kelly will join us this hour at 4:30. Then at 5 o'clock, the founder of Marco Polo, been documenting the Hunter Biden saga, including every last detail on that laptop. Garrett Ziegler is here. He's been at that Hunter Biden trial. We'll get his impression of the events this week. And you can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Hunter Biden found guilty, the jury quickly deliberating on those gun charges. Yes, they say, he did lie on a gun background check form about his drug use. The evidence for that is overwhelming. But the reality here is this thing was never going to get to this point were it not for the IRS whistleblowers who came forward and said there was a massive effort within the federal government to protect the Biden family from consequences whatsoever. For more on this, I want to bring in Tristan Leavitt now. He's the president of Empower Oversight and represents those IRS whistleblowers, Joseph Ziegler and Gary Shapley. Tristan, thank you so much for being back with us. Really appreciate it, sir.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Vince.
My immediate reaction today was the bare minimum here, and of course, many of us look at this and go, this is the bare minimum you could go after the Bidens for. We would not have even had this were it not for the IRS whistleblowers. Am I wrong?
No, that's absolutely right. If you look back at the beginning of 2023 through 2022, after the IRS had recommended these charges, the FBI had recommended charges, and DOJ had signed off on them. But David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Delaware, had been convinced in one place after another that he shouldn't touch Hunter Biden. And so by the beginning of 2023, this was going nowhere. There would have been not even a plea deal, ironically, were it not for the whistleblowers saying this is outrageous, right? All these charges everybody agreed on, and now they are just going to let this whole thing die because of this political interference by appointees of President Biden. So you look at the timing, and it's very clear from the TikTok that the time that this all got, the apparatus started moving again was when the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware became aware that Gary Shapley and Joe Ziegler were going to make disclosures to Congress. And that's when they reached out. That's when they concocted the plea deal that they hastily assembled. And because it was so sloppily done, that's how you saw it fall apart in front of Judge Noriega. So everything that's happened since that time came just because these guys came forward to say, this is not right. This is what everybody agreed on. And now just because of this person is the president's son, nothing's going to happen.
I wonder, you and I have talked about it before, but the role that was played by the assistant U.S. attorney working for David Weiss, a woman called Leslie Wolf, because the IRS whistleblowers indicated that she was the one who was quite often telling them that they couldn't take these investigative steps that would go further, get anywhere near Joe Biden. She was responsible for alerting the Biden world ahead of major investigative actions that gave them the time to prepare themselves to prevent getting into any further legal jeopardy. And that she also was responsible for negotiating this sweetheart deal, which would end up before the court. But by the time it did end up before the court, she was taken off the case. What do you make of her role in all of this?
I have always found it fascinating ever since I learned about this. But when the documents, it both appeared, I can't remember if it was in the New York Times story or Politico story, but last year there were these stories that had very in-depth documents, clearly from, presumably one half from Hunter Biden's legal team and the other half from perhaps the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware. But either way, there's these documents out there. They've now been released to Congress and made their way to various places. So I've seen some of these. And you can see that on May 15th, which is the day that the IRS agents were taken off the case. So April of 2023 was when our team wrote a letter to Congress saying that Gary Shapley wanted to come forward. He wasn't named, but obviously the people in Delaware knew exactly, based on what was in that letter, knew exactly what it was about. And so then you move forward to May 15th when they were taken off. And that's the day that, after hearing nothing from the prosecutors, Hunter Biden's team gets this contact from Leslie Wolf, who offers them a plea deal where he has to plead guilty to nothing whatsoever. And I can't remember if it's a week after that or 2 weeks after that, that she comes back in the emails and says, well, we checked with David Weiss and he said that we need to change it a little bit. You have to at least plead guilty to this. And I just thought it was so interesting that she was willing to just hand it all over there. And they came back to David Weiss, and I can only imagine he says, well, this looks terrible, terrible. You have to at least make him plead guilty to something. And then what the world saw as the sweetheart plea deal was less sweet than the original offer from Leslie Wolf. It just boggles my mind.
Yeah, mine too. So when you hear all of these major media figures today saying that this is a sign that the American system works, that justice is blind, that Joe Biden put the country before his own family, what do you think?
I think that is a complete load of garbage. I think the American system, were it not for these whistleblowers, would have completely failed the American justice system because, this is not how prosecutors are supposed to act. These are not the kinds of considerations that are supposed to be taken into account when making prosecutorial decisions or investigative decisions, but they clearly did in this case, and it's only because someone's last name was Biden. And so all of this commentary is just very misplaced, I think. Anybody that looks back at the timeline can see that were it not for these whistleblowers, you very much would have had someone getting, special treatment, that the second tier of justice that you get if you're related to the President of the United States.
So, and as the IRS whistleblowers were dealing with this investigation, as I recall, they were getting frustrated because the investigation was moving so slowly that the statutes of limitations were beginning to run out on the most important years. Is that right?
Yes, the key real statute of limitations that expired was from a very deliberate decision by David Weiss, and so that related to the 2014 and 2015 years. But yeah, that's right. Throughout 2022, as they were not getting close to that. I think an important factor to remember there is that the statute of limitations would have run out already were it not for a tolling agreement with the defense. So that was an option. Hunter Biden's team was willing to keep stringing that out. The hope, if you're a defendant, is by agreeing to extend the statute of limitations, it gives you more time to convince prosecutors as to why you shouldn't be charged. Whereas if you force them to make a snap decision, they're going to come after you most likely. And so they had already indicated they were willing to extend the tolling agreement, to extend the statute of limitations. And it was just David Weiss that just made a straight up decision that he wasn't going to do that anymore. He was just going to let those years with all the foreign income there from Ukraine and some of the other places, the $1 million Burisma paychecks, he was going to let all that expire. And that was the beginning of the real breach between him and when Gary Shapley first said, first blew the whistle. And ever since then, David Weiss has clearly had it out for Gary Shapley.
In your experience, how unusual is that? A defendant says, I'm willing to extend the statute of limitations, and the government prosecutor says, no, in fact, we're just going to let it lapse?
I mean, it's extremely unusual, and the circumstances here come after, those years would have had to be brought in D.C. You have a U.S. attorney in D.C., Matthew Graves, who was appointed by President Biden, and this has been investigated now by the House committees, but you have this situation where Weiss goes to them and Graves bends over backwards to try and convince Weiss that it's a bad idea. And so Weiss says, oh, it's my idea. Today in the press conference, he thanked Merrick Garland for giving him such independence, but you can just see Weiss is blowing whichever way the wind goes. And at that point, he had just been convinced that, well, it just doesn't make sense. We're going to go ahead and just let this lapse.
It's just amazing. I want to move on to another issue that you're in the news for this week because you're doing such great work over Empower Oversight, and it involves an FBI whistleblower who apparently his colleagues were questioned about whether or not he was a supporter of Donald Trump's. What can you tell us about that story?
So this is an individual who's not been public. Unlike Marcus Allen, last week we had this total vindication for him, one of the FBI whistleblowers that I testified alongside the weaponization subcommittee with. There are several of these FBI whistleblowers we've represented who've been public, and this is not one of those because unlike those other individuals who just objected within the FBI to how it was conducting its January 6th investigations, this is somebody who went downtown in Washington, D.C. to hear President Trump speak. When President Trump said go to the Capitol, he went to the Capitol, but he's very much a rule follower. He's someone that didn't, go inside the Capitol. He's someone that didn't engage in any violence. But he disclosed the day after January 6th to his supervisor that he'd been there. He'd been entirely peaceful, didn't engage in anything, but left when it looked like it looked like there were problems there. Mm-hmm. And so a year later, he came under into the suspicion funnel of the security division within the FBI. And to be fair, again, he had been down there, so it's legitimate for them to start investigating and asking around about that. He's passed a polygraph saying he didn't go inside, didn't engage in any violence. But what we've now learned, because the FBI didn't seem to have believed him, right? They've moved forward and they've taken these actions. So looking through his security file, what we've discovered is that instead of asking questions of his colleagues just about his attendance that day or anything else, they asked them first, in these interviews, they would tell them you were required to answer or your own security clearance could be in jeopardy. And then they asked them the context of their knowing him and whether they had socialized with him. So they're including asking things about outside of the workplace. And then they asked whether he ever vocalized support for President Trump, whether he ever vocalized objection to the COVID-19 vaccine. These are things that are totally unrelated to anyone's job at the FBI, totally inappropriate for them to be asking about, and particularly in the context of an investigation into whether or not he should continue to have a security clearance. So this is a huge deal, and we are hearing that it's part of, as we have a lot of whistleblowers come to us, it's part of a bigger pattern that the security division really did have these political biases. And once people came to their attention, being referred from somewhere in the FBI, those biases really impacted the types of questions that they asked and how they drummed people out of the FBI for having just conservative views or views that those in the leadership of the FBI didn't align with.
Yeah, I mean, you have here that he was the president of the United States. So if you had an FBI agent signaling that he was supportive of the president of the United States, that would be held against him.
Yeah, this was all after. This is all after. This is while President Biden is the president. But yeah, that's significant, and we think it's also, the timeline is interesting because at this point, there was a time when a lot of FBI agents were making hard decisions because there was the vaccine mandate and they didn't want to receive the vaccine. Well, by the time these questions were asked of our clients' coworkers, this was 3 months after the federal vaccine mandate had been, there was an injunction on that. So there was zero reason whatsoever for them to be asking these kinds of questions. When I led an agency called the Merit Systems Protection Board during the Trump administration, when there was the initiation of I guess this stemmed over. So it's an independent agency. I was there also during the beginning of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. When the vaccine came out initially, we had to be extremely careful about where that information goes because it's people's private health information. And so to the extent that needed to be gathered, there was a lot of discussion of how do you do this? How do you make sure that this isn't just strewn about the agency? In this case, for the security division to be asking about it is completely inappropriate.
And these are political litmus tests. They're merely, has he expressed something that the average Republican might express? Because the questions that didn't include things like, has he voiced support for BLM? I don't see that on the list.
That's right. And the most clear analog for, the vaccine here would be, imagine how outraged Democrats would be if the FBI in a future administration asked people, have you ever heard your coworker voice any support for receiving an abortion? That's just not appropriate. That's just not the place for the FBI to be snooping around into the personal views of its employees.
Okay. And lastly, his status as a whistleblower, is it possible to share what he's blowing the whistle on? Is it his own experience here of being targeted by the FBI? What is it that he's been revealing?
Yes, it's just his own experience. So again, that's part of why he's somewhat differently postured than other folks that we have represented that had disclosures that were unrelated to their own retaliation. So in those cases, we have brought to the public, these things that were being disclosed by them here. This is part of why we've been working with this individual for over a year, but it's all been behind the scenes. But as we got that file and saw this, then, even though he has no desire to be a public person, but he acknowledged this was a big deal and we needed to bring this to the public's attention.
Yeah, the FBI questioning whether FBI agents have, quote, vocalized support for President Trump. This is dangerous. Tristan Leavitt at Empower Oversight, thank you, sir, for all of your excellent work and your time as always. There's a lot of stuff that the January 6th crew, orchestrated by Nancy Pelosi, never actually revealed to the public that they had in their possession. And it's not like it's a mystery to Nancy Pelosi. This is footage that was captured by her daughter, Alexandra Pelosi, who is a documentary filmmaker. She just happened to be, trailing her mom with a camera during the entirety of January 6th, capturing every moment. But only a little bit of it has been shared. Remember, previously we've heard Nancy Pelosi threatening to punch the president of the United States in the face. There was no Secret Service investigation into that. Obviously, why would they do that? But Nancy Pelosi has also, according to newly surfaced video, again captured by her daughter, and apparently being included in an HBO documentary. Well, in it, Nancy Pelosi says she takes responsibility, blame for the National Guard not being there on January 6, 2021, the high holy day on the American left?
We have responsibility, Terry. We did not have any accountability for what was going on there, and we should have. This is ridiculous. You're going to ask me in the middle of the thing when they've already breached the inaugural stuff that should we call the Capitol Police? I mean, the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient resources.
That is not a question of how they have. They don't know. They clearly didn't know, and I take responsibility for not having them just prepare for more.
I take responsibility for not having them. So there she is saying that she's to blame. Now, of course, that's true in so many ways. In fact, House leadership denied the Capitol Police Chief's request over and over and over ahead of January 6th to have the National Guard there. Remember, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser didn't want the National Guard in the streets of D.C. She wanted a light presence, optics and everything. Meanwhile, President Trump was offering National Guard. Hey, could you guys use some National Guard? No, Nancy Pelosi screeches through her dentures. That's the new video. What to make of it? Julie Kelly joins us right after the news. Stay with us here on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hey, good afternoon to you. It is 4:35 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, Garrett Ziegler will join us at the top of the hour. He's the founder of Marco Polo, a repository of all things Hunter Biden, and he's been tracking that Hunter Biden trial in Delaware in person, getting yelled at by the Biden family. He's got a lot to talk about when we have Garrett Ziegler on top of the hour. You can join us, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. One of the high holy days of the American left, January 6, 2021, newly surfaced footage shows Nancy Pelosi taking the blame for not calling in the National Guard.
Should we call the Capitol Police? I mean, the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient resources.
That is not a question of how they have. They don't know. They clearly didn't know, and I take responsibility for not having them just prepare for more.
There she is. She's lovely, isn't she? Joining us now, someone who's actually lovely, Julie Kelly, the author of Declassified by Julie Kelly, the Substack, and the book January 6, How Democrats Used the Capitol Protests to Launch a War on Terror Against the Political Right. Julie, good to talk to you again.
You too, Vince. Glad you are feeling better and back at the microphone. And
you're so sweet.
Doing your thing.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be back here doing this and talking to you. This is interesting footage to me because it is true. She does seem to, quote, take responsibility. The way she's saying it, though, is almost like she's being the hero. I'm falling on the sword. Fine, I'll take the responsibility for the National Guard not being here. But based on your reporting, she really does deserve the blame, doesn't she?
She does. And Vince, I'll be honest, I really don't know what to make of that clip because we see Nancy Pelosi doing this whole performance during the entire day. Her daughter, the documentarian, is filming it. You recall before the joint session, she's in her office threatening that she's going to have Donald Trump arrested for trespassing and she's going to punch him out, right? She's going to punch him out.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we see this and we see kind of this performance at Fort McNair between, her and Chuck Schumer, this tough talk and we need a tweet by the president, et cetera. So I don't really know what to make of that because Nancy Pelosi in almost 3.5 years has never accepted responsibility for any facet of January 6th, even as critics such as myself and others directly pointed the finger at her because her sergeant at arms, along with Mitch McConnell's sergeant at arms, make up most of the Capitol Police Board. They were the ones to seek authorization for the National Guard. We know that Steve Sund, the Capitol Police Chief, begged January 4th, 5th, and throughout the day on the 6th for those troops who were on standby at the Armory. They were ready to go, but they never were deployed. And so all of a sudden now Nancy Pelosi comes out and pretending she's taking some sort of responsibility. Doesn't add up.
Yeah, no, not at all. And as you point out, the Capitol Police Chief at the time, Stephen Sund, over the course, I believe it was 6 times, attempted to request over the course of days assistance from the National Guard, and it never came. He was turned down by the House Sergeant at Arms, Paul Irving, who works directly for Nancy Pelosi. Paul Irving said that he wasn't comfortable with the, quote, optics of bringing in the National Guard. And so this is basically, when you have the House Sergeant at Arms saying, no, we're not going to do that, that's as good as Nancy Pelosi saying that.
It absolutely is. And that is what Paul Irving has testified to, the optics. That's also what we're told Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy and others were concerned about, the optics of having the National Guard.
Yeah.
In addition to the Capitol Police, Nancy Pelosi side of it, now we have reports that I have at my Substack, Declassified, Mark Milley and Ryan McCarthy in cahoots, changing the chain of command the day before January 6th. Where Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy, apparently a Milley loyalist, I am told, said that William Walker, who was the head of the D.C. National Guard, had to get final authority from Secretary McCarthy before he could deploy the quick reaction force from the D.C. Guard. William Walker has testified, number one, he didn't hear from Ryan McCarthy or get authorization until after 5 o'clock. Now, almost all of the violence was over by then. You had National Guard from other states. You had all sorts of law enforcement there. But also that this chain of command was highly unusual, and he had never seen that sort of modification.
What does Mark Milley have to do with any of this? Mark Milley was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs, by practice, are not actually a part of a chain of command at all. They report to the president. They're advisors to the president, but they wield no power over these guys.
Mark Milley, by his own confession, because as you know, he is a megalomaniac, he has admitted numerous times that he violated posse comitatus, which is federal law prohibiting the military from being involved in domestic law enforcement, with a few exceptions. Mark Milley, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has nothing to do with how the D.C. Metro Police or Capitol Police were going to protect the Capitol or not. He has admitted, too, that he was on these high-level phone calls with DOD, with DOJ, with DHS, Capitol Police, who were discussing intelligence that they had leading up to January 6th about potential violence. And at one point, someone points out to Chairman Milley, you're not supposed to be involved in domestic law enforcement matters, like kind of chiding him. This is in one of the transcripts. But he admitted he was surveilling the Proud Boys. Why are you have troops overseas? You have tense situations that he was creating himself. We know that he admitted his counterparts in places like China, reassuring them Donald Trump would not start any, sort of conflict in his last weeks in office. I mean, this man is a straight up traitor.
This is, again,
he is not.
And this is not his responsibility. The Joint Chiefs have no operational control over the military. None. Their job is to advise the President of the United States. That's it. And here you have Mark Milley sticking his nose into this and trying to restructure chains of command and order the National Guard around and figure out who goes to whom. He has no role in any of that. How did that even happen, that he could adopt all these powers onto himself?
Well, because he's untouchable, and we still see that. I mean, even with all of his confessions that he's made, he has paid no price for what the usurpation of power or taking over authorities that he has no right to do. Recall that he issued a statement a few days after January 6th calling that day an insurrection. Why are you weighing in on what is a political matter? Even if you view it as a law enforcement matter, you have no right to do that. He was in communication with Susan Rice before January 6th, Robert Gates, Chuck Schumer, all of the same people in deep state and the bureaucratic apparatus, the regime, who spent almost a decade trying to prevent Trump from taking office and then getting him out of office. So there's a lot more to learn. And here's the kicker, Vince. He took all of his records related to January 6th, and after that day, he classified them at the highest level. So no one can touch them unless President Trump wins re-election in orders the immediate declassification of all of Mark Milley's dirty fingerprints on January 6th.
I want to play some more audio for you. This is testimony before Congress by Lieutenant Colonel Earl Matthews. He was a colonel who was the top lawyer for the D.C. National Guard during January 6th of 2021. And here's what he's saying about Army officials and why the National Guard was not deployed on January 6th.
Colonel Matthews, same question for you. Do you believe that deployment of the D.C. National Guard was delayed?
Yes, sir. I believe that it was a result of an overcautious, reluctant, hesitant, facilitating leadership. And I think they were concerned about the optics, the political optics of a military presence here. And I don't think they trusted the commander-in-chief. And I think that was because of our senior-ranking military officer who was making disparaging remarks about the president to them.
Yeah, and speaking of the commander-in-chief, then at the time, President Trump, he's been pretty clear that he offered National Guard support ahead of January 6th to the Capitol. Additionally, it's not just Nancy Pelosi who's turned down National Guard, Julie Kelly, but the mayor of D.C., Muriel Bowser, was eager to not have National Guard in the streets of D.C. For January 6th, and she was pretty clear about that at the time.
She was, and in fact, we still have the memo where she authorized or requested only about 340 National Guard's troops to help with traffic control because, of course, so many streets were shut down. So they were basically deployed to certain areas around the Capitol and around the city to, help pedestrians, probably direct them to the Capitol. No, I'm just kidding. Those are decent men. They wouldn't do anything like that. But, and Ryan McCarthy, again, at D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, a hard left Democrat, at her office the afternoon of January 6th, preparing a press conference with her. Why would Ryan McCarthy, the Army Secretary, be with the mayor of Washington, D.C. instead of at his post or at the Capitol Police Center where they were monitoring all of this, or at the Department of Defense? Why was he with the mayor of Washington, D.C., unreachable by Earl Matthews, who you just heard, and his boss, William Walker, until after 5 o'clock?
Well, in retrospect, as a political matter, it seems pretty obvious why they would not want the National Guard there, because if they could limit the number of deterrents, and the more they could kind of whip the crowd into a frenzy, the more they could exploit it politically in the years ahead. And that's definitely what they did.
It absolutely. And, I've been saying this since the beginning, and a handful of others, and this is why I'm so grateful for you covering my work, is that when Mark Milley talked about Donald Trump wanting a Reichstag fire sort of event, it actually is Mark Milley and others. And, of course, people have described January 6th as our own Reichstag fire, where then it was used and weaponized against opponents of the incoming regime. And so this is why Nancy Pelosi now is back on cable news and MSNBC and talking about, we have to restore the narrative of January 6th. This is dangerous. People were killed, et cetera. They see this completely being shredded. And so they're desperate now to salvage this at the worst possible time as so many facets of January 6th, including the corruption of the J6 committee, are being fully exposed.
Yeah, in fact, Nancy Pelosi, in the wake of this audio being released yesterday, where she takes responsibility for failing to call in the National Guard, she went on MSNBC for a cleanup job. Nicole Wallace fluffed her in this audio. Take a listen.
Why do you think this is stirred up and a brouhaha on the right and in some corners of the media today?
Well, because the fact is that the President of the United States, the former president, and his toadies do not want to face the facts. They're trying to do revisionist history on January 6th. But we cannot let us be dragged into their, again, false impression of what happened that day.
Revisionist history. So, Julie Kelly, let me ask you, if I'm to read your excellent Substack, Declassified by Julie Kelly, and if I'm also to then look at the public hearings done by the so-called January 6th committee, which one is going to be closer to history?
Well, I mean, not to brag, I prefer to be humble, but, I definitely think my account and a handful of others, Darren Beatty, and some other people have done really solid work on this. And of course, people like you covering it, it's a lot closer to reality. And we're going to find out a lot more, Vince. And I think that they know that there's more coming down the pipe.
Yeah.
Shocking revelations that are still being concealed about what happened before and on that day.
Well, also, I mean, look at all the depositions the January 6th committee took. They took how many thousands of hours of depositions. They share a limited selection from those. They refuse to release the lion's share of the information that they gathered. They delete a lot of the information and prevent the Republicans from even having access to it. They don't show exculpatory information to include Donald Trump's remarks in the Capitol saying that he wanted people to peacefully make their voices heard and patriotically make their voices heard. It is pretty clear a hatchet job. And here you have Nancy Pelosi suggesting that it's Republicans who are trying to advance revisionist history when she's the very person who presented revisionist history in the first place. So you have a January 6th committee that hides all of the real evidence and a Julie Kelly Substack that presents it. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I like that assessment, but I also want to give kudos to Barry Loudermilk, who is the Republican representative, head of the subcommittee, who is releasing much more of the video, who has discovered the existence of these destroyed encrypted files that the committee destroyed right before Republicans took over, that discovered that 1,000 video interviews had been destroyed. So he is the one that's really uncovering this. And, Nancy Pelosi, revisionist history is going to be the actual reality of the situation, not what you guys have defrauded the American people about the events of that day.
Yeah, they didn't even release the footage of people being let into the Capitol, which actually happened too. Thank you very much, as always, Julie Kelly, for your excellent reporting and your time today. Good to talk to you. To the phones we go. Chris calling in from Marshall, line 1. Chris, you're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hello, sir.
Okay, now, listen, it's been an hour and 40 minutes on hold, so I've kind of augmented what I told Corey about a little bit. But, it's good to hear your voice. I would listen to you if you had a Stephen Hawking voice, man. And you've got a lot of people that got your back, buddy.
Thanks, brother.
I got a couple of serious and I got a funny. But the serious is Hunter relying on sympathy for being an addict with this whole case. I've been sober for 34 years, man. I know that the biggest concept that you got to deal with is accountability.
Right.
But, onward and upward, onto the more fun stuff, man. Why is it that every time I hear Nancy Pelosi speak, the easy one is to say, oh, she's been tipping the bottle. But she always reminds me of Stan's sister, Shelley Marsh, from South Park. It sounds like she needs to have her retainer adjusted. Every single time I hear her, it's like she's got to have her retainer adjusted.
Let me just remind me, because I am not a close watcher of South Park. I've seen a couple of episodes, and I crack up every time. But Stan is one of the boys. Randy's his father, right?
Yep, and then his sister, his 13-year-old vindictive sister, is Shelley Marsh, and she, of course, she sports the braces and the retainer, so she always got this voice. She always reminds me of, I don't know which one reminds me of which. I don't know if she reminds me of Pelosi or Pelosi reminds me of her.
All right, so I just pulled it up. I'm looking at a picture of her. She's got a headgear on, and she's got a retainer in or something. So this is Nancy Pelosi, just so by way of comparison.
Should we call the Capitol Police? I mean, the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient resources.
That is not a question of how they had been. They don't know.
Okay, all right, that's Nancy Pelosi. And then this is Shelley Marsh in conversation with her father, Randy.
I hate marijuana.
Yes, we all know, but why?
It stinks, and it makes everyone in this town dumber than they already are. Everyone in this country is getting dumber, and I wish marijuana was illegal again.
That's pretty good, actually.
She does the voice.
Yeah, that's one of the closest impressions yet, I think. Shelley Marsh has really nailed the Nancy Pelosi. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the compliment and the and the observation. And the education, of course, on South Park, which occasionally we need. All right, hey, coming up, Garrett Ziegler is going to be here. He runs that Marco Polo website where they track Hunter Biden's crazy life in detail. In fact, he's been tracking the trial in Delaware this week. He'll give us the update. He was screamed at by the Biden family. Stay with us.